The year was 1621, and Thomas Whitfield had never been so cold in his life. He stood at the edge of a forest so vast it seemed to have no end, holding an axe that felt heavier than anything he had carried across the Atlantic. Behind him, the Mayflower was long gone. Ahead of him, nothing existed that could be called shelter. The wind came from the north with a kind of violence he had never encountered in England, and the first real winter of the New World was not arriving. It had already arrived, without announcement, without mercy, without any concern for who was ready and who was not. Thomas was not ready. None of them were ready. 45 of the original passengers had already died. Not from war, not from wild animals, not from any of the dramatic dangers the pamphlets in London had described with such thrilling detail. They died from cold, from wet clothes that never dried, from sleeping on the ground inside a common house that was little more than 4 walls and a dream. They died from the simple, relentless fact that a human body cannot survive indefinitely without warmth. And warmth required a structure that none of them had yet been able to build. Thomas understood something that morning with absolute clarity. A man with no house was not a settler. He was simply a man waiting to die in a new place. So he raised the axe. What happened next was not heroic. It was not fast. It was not the kind of story anyone would tell around a fire later with pride and laughter. It was brutal, repetitive, and humbling work that took weeks and left every muscle in his body speaking languages of pain he had not known existed. But it produced something real, something that would stand on that ground for the next 6 years before the wood finally rotted and had to be rebuilt, which itself was a kind of victory because 6 years meant 6 winters survived. The first thing Thomas learned was that the forest was not his friend, but it was his only supplier. The trees were everywhere, overwhelming in their abundance, mocking in their size. Eastern white pine, red oak, chestnut, elm, species that English carpenters would have paid serious money to work with back home, were simply standing here in their thousands, untouched, indifferent. But a standing tree and a usable plank are separated by an enormous amount of suffering, and that suffering began with felling. A single mature oak, the kind needed for structural posts and main beams, could take 2 men an entire day to cut down using the tools they had brought from England. The saws were designed for smaller English timber. The axes were functional but not optimized for trees of this diameter, and the men swinging them were merchants, weavers, a printer, a tailor, not foresters. Thomas himself had been a cobbler. He had spent the previous decade thinking carefully about leather, about stitching patterns, about the curvature of a human heel. He had never once thought about how to fell a 60-foot tree without it crushing him or the men standing near him. The colonists learned from watching each other fail. They learned that a tree falls in the direction of its lean, and that if you did not understand which direction it was leaning before you started cutting, you would understand it very quickly and very dramatically at the moment it came down. They learned that the roots of these American trees went far deeper than English roots, that the wood was denser, that the grain behaved differently. They learned that the sound the trunk made in the final seconds before falling, a deep, tearing groan that seemed to come from inside the earth rather than from the tree itself, was one of the most elemental sounds a human being could hear. After felling came the work of converting a round log into usable timber, and this was where the colonial carpenter revealed himself to be something between a craftsman and a philosopher of suffering. The pit saw was the central technology of the era, and calling it a technology is generous. It was a long, 2-handled saw designed to cut logs lengthwise into planks. 1 man stood on top of the log. 1 man stood below, in a pit dug into the ground for exactly this purpose. They pulled the saw back and forth for hours. The man below received a constant shower of sawdust directly into his eyes, mouth, and lungs. The man above controlled the line and bore the weight of keeping the cut straight. They traded positions when one could no longer continue, and then they continued. A single log might take half a day to convert into a small number of rough planks, and a small house required hundreds of planks. Thomas became the man in the pit more often than not. He was shorter than most of the other men, which made him better suited to the confined space below. This was the kind of logic that governed life in those first years. Not who was most skilled, not who was most experienced, who fit. The structure they were building followed a design that the English colonists carried in their memory rather than on paper. A post and beam frame, the same fundamental architecture used in English farmhouses for centuries. 4 heavy corner posts deeply buried in the ground. Horizontal beams connecting them at the top called plates. Diagonal braces at the corners to prevent the whole frame from racking sideways in wind. Rafters rising from the plates to a central ridge beam at the top. The joints that held this frame together were cut entirely by hand, using chisels and mallets, and a degree of patience that modern people cannot fully imagine, because modern people have never needed it. The mortise and tenon joint, a rectangular tongue cut from one beam that fitted into a matching rectangular socket cut into another, had to fit precisely without the assistance of bolts, screws, or metal fasteners of any significance. The fit was achieved through skill and through the use of wooden pegs, driven through holes bored at a slight offset, so that the peg, as it was driven home, pulled the joint tight. This technique was called draw boring, and it had been refined over centuries of English carpentry to the point where it worked with extraordinary reliability. It was one of the few things that worked as expected in the New World. The walls of Thomas's house were not made of planks, not initially. Planks required the pit saw, which required time they did not have in those first desperate months. The walls were made of something called wattle and daub, a woven lattice of thin branches called wattle, plastered on both sides with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. The smell of this mixture as it was applied and dried was not one that inspired confidence. The appearance was not one that inspired confidence either, but it was insulating. It was relatively quick to produce, and it kept out the worst of the wind with a stubbornness that surprised everyone who had worked so hard to create it. The roof presented the most immediate challenge. Rain in New England was not the polite, intermittent rain of southern England. It arrived in quantities and with a horizontal determination that seemed almost personal. A roof that leaked was not an inconvenience. It was a threat to survival because wet sleeping conditions in near-freezing temperatures killed people with a slow, certain efficiency. Thomas and the other men understood this, and so the roof received their most careful attention. Thatch was the initial solution, because it was what English builders knew. Long grass and reeds layered in dense, overlapping bundles and tied to wooden battens running across the rafters. A properly thatched roof was surprisingly effective. It shed water through its surface texture, rather than through impermeability, the way a duck's feathers shed water, each layer directing rain to the next, until it fell from the eaves far from the walls below. The problem was that the grasses available in New England were not the long-stemmed English thatching reeds they knew. The colonists experimented. They failed. They adapted. They found that certain sedges and rushes, cut at the right moment and allowed to dry correctly, could perform acceptably. Acceptable in 1621 meant surviving to see spring. The fireplace and chimney were the last major elements, and they were not optional. They were the reason the house could exist at all as a year-round dwelling. The chimneys of the first colonial houses were built from the same wattle and daub mixture as the walls, plastered around a wooden frame. This was a construction technique that everyone involved understood to be dangerous, and yet it was the technique available to them. Stone chimneys required cut stone, which required time and skill they did not yet possess in sufficient quantity. Brick required a working kiln which did not yet exist, so they built wood-framed chimneys plastered with clay, and they kept the fires modest, and they watched the fireplaces constantly for signs of smouldering, and some of them watched poorly, and some of those houses burned down, and the families who lost their houses either died or were absorbed into other households or started again from the beginning. Thomas's chimney did not burn down. This was partly skill and partly luck, and partly the fact that his wife, a woman named Mary, who had said almost nothing about any of this since they arrived, but who watched everything with a focused intensity that Thomas had learned to respect profoundly, never let the fire grow larger than it needed to be. She understood something about the house that the men who built it sometimes forgot in their exhaustion, that the house was not finished. It was not safe. It was an ongoing negotiation with collapse, and it required attention every single day to keep losing that negotiation. By the time spring arrived, the house was standing. It was roughly 16 feet wide and 20 feet long. It had one room because one room was warmer than two. It had a single window covered with oiled paper rather than glass, because glass was extraordinarily expensive and had not yet arrived in sufficient quantity from England. The floor was packed earth, not wood, because laying a wood floor required planks, and every plank they could produce was prioritized for structural uses. The ceiling was low, just above 6 feet, because every inch of height added to the volume of air that needed to be heated, and heat was still the most precious resource in the colony. By any modern standard, it was barely shelter. By the standards of 1621 New England, it was a triumph. Thomas stood outside it on a morning in April when the air still carried cold, but the light had changed, had taken on that particular quality of returning warmth that people who live without central heating learn to read the way sailors read weather. He looked at the walls he had built. He looked at the roof. He looked at the thin thread of smoke rising from the chimney where Mary was already at the fire, beginning the day's first task. He thought about the ship. He thought about the pamphlets. He thought about London, with its stone buildings and its glass windows, and its streets so familiar he could walk them in complete darkness without a single hesitation. He thought about the 60 people still alive in this settlement, in their 16 by 20 rooms with their oiled paper windows and their clay chimneys, all of them having arrived with one idea of the new world and discovered an entirely different one that did not ask what you had been before, only what you could build now. He picked up the axe. There was a second house to start.